We have The Birth of Venus, In the Company of the Courtesan, Sacred Hearts, and now Blood and Beauty. Apparently you just can't get enough of the Italian Renaissance. What lies underneath this vivid passion?
There isn't another period in history like it. You could argue that everything that we have in European culture stems from a moment in the Italian Renaissance. But I think what's happened to me is that the more I have written and learned about this period, the more I've become fascinated by an incredible paradox at the center of it, which is at one level, when we think of the Italian Renaissance, we think of the great moment of the arrival of beauty and art and creativity and learning. But the more work you do in this period, the more you understand that the same energy that gave us that creativity and that beauty also gave corruption and brutality. So what you're looking at is a society which is pulled between violence and war and corruption and tremendous creativity and excitement in the arts and learning. And there's something about those two things together that is completely irresistible for a novelist.
Do you remember what made you fall in love with this arts, but also human mind pinnacle? Was it a painting? Was it a book? Was it a site? What was it primarily?
It was a city.
Yes?
It was a city. I was in something of a crisis in the year 2000, a good year to have a crisis, insofar as I had been writing up until that point contemporary thrillers.
Exactly,
and the thing
yes.
I loved about contemporary thrillers is the pull between the fact that you can write about a serious issue, but you can write about it in a popular form where the importance is the pushing and driving of the plot. So really good storytelling and serious analysis. But if you write too many thrillers, you begin to realize that there are rules to writing thrillers, right? The plot is always uppermost, and there always has to be an answer. Something has to explain the mystery at the end. And I was beginning to want to write deeper into character, and I was also very aware that life doesn't end up tied up in a bow with an answer. And I found myself spending 3 or 4 weeks in the city of Florence. And if you're going to have a crisis, I recommend a city like Florence to have it in. Because, of course, what happens if you spend any time in a city like this is the past starts to talk to you. You just can't help it. It is everywhere. And I started to ask myself a question which went back to my very early days with a love of history, because I studied history at university.
Exactly. The love was there already.
The love was there already.
Yes.
And
the interest for Renaissance, for the arts.
Well, certainly the love of history. I had started reading through reading historical fiction, and then had come my passion for history, which I studied at Cambridge academically. And then for a long time, history seemed too complex to be able to write about it. I wasn't an academic. But what happened in Florence is I started to ask a very simple question, which is, what the hell happened here 500 years ago to make this small, provincial little city in the middle of northern Italy the cauldron of one of the great moments of European cultural revolution? And it was out of that idea grew The Birth of Venus.
And this leads me to my next question, because we have 3 books, The Birth of Venus, In the Company of the Courtesan, and now Blood and Beauty. And we also have 3 archetypal cities. We have Florence, Venice, and Rome. Yeah. Was this the order you discovered the cities?
No, because there's a book missing actually there, which I don't think is translated into Romanian
Sacred Hearts.
yet, which is Sacred Hearts. So the first
set in Ferrara.
Set in a tiny city, but a very beautiful city in northeastern Italy. I think that the impetus for the first 3 books came as much from the fact that what I was discovering when I went back to do my research was that history itself had changed since I studied it. And because of a series of questions that we've been asking of history over the last 30 years, particularly women have been asking a very simple question, which was, excuse me, it seems like history is full of dead white men, so where were the women? Where were half of the population? My discovery was that over the last 30 years, we knew a great deal more about the life of women during this amazing period in Italian history. So The Birth of Venus and In the Company of the Courtesan and then Sacred Hearts looked at the voice and choice and lack of choice of women during this period. So one was about a young woman who wants to become a painter.
Yes.
The other one was about a job which was open to some if you had the courage and the wit and the beauty to do it, which was a courtesan, a high-class prostitute. And Venice was the great city of courtesans.
We'll talk about that,
right?
of course.
And then the astonishing fact that something like almost half of all well-born women ended up in convents. Not because they had a vocation and love of God, but because there wasn't enough money to marry them off in dowries. And so I suddenly started to think, oh my God, there we have the equivalent of a republic of women behind closed walls. What was it like to be them during that period? How awful was it? But also, in some ways, how creative was it? How much better was it than being married and having 200 children or whatever and dying in childbirth?
Aquella voluntad honesta y pura, ilustre y hermosísima María, que en mí, de celebrar tu hermosura, tu ingenio y tu valor estar solía, a despecho y pesar de la aventura, que por otros caminos me desvía, está y estará tanto en mí clavada, cuanto del cuerpo el alma acompañada. Y aún no se me figura que me toca aqueste oficio solamente en vida, mas con la lengua muerta y fría en la boca, pienso mover la voz a ti de vida. Libre mi alma de su estrecha roca, por el estigio lago conducida, celebrándote irá y aquel sonido hará parar las aguas del olvido. Mas la fortuna de mi mal no harta, me aflige y de un trabajo en otro lleva. Ya de la patria, ya del bien me aparta, ya mi paciencia en mil maneras prueba. Y lo que siento más es que la carta, donde mi pluma en tu alabanza mueva, poniendo en su lugar cuidados vanos, me quita y me arrebata de las manos.
Always in the background, if you're working on Renaissance Italy, there are the names of certain big, big families. The Medici are one, and of course the Borgias are the other. So eventually I had to end up in Rome, and I had to end up with the Borgias.
It's not ending, I hope. As a matter of fact, it's just an actual point in your historical percourse, let's say,
Yes.
historically and fictionally speaking. It's not an end.
Absolutely not. Till the day I die, I should be writing about the Italian Renaissance. Because the deeper you get, as in any period of history, the deeper you get, the richer you get. The more characters you find, the more complexity you find, and the more parallels with modernity you find. So although you find a narrow seam in which you are mining, it always gets more interesting and deeper as you go along.
It is the rebirth of historical fiction that you propose to your today's reader. Do you know who your target audience really is?
Well, I suspect my target audience is people who have always had some interest in history, by which I mean, who hasn't got an interest in history? I mean, those people who don't think that history is important don't understand the present. So I think that's potentially a very wide audience. I think the great challenge of historical fiction now is to find men as well as women. No? I think it's always been an area that women have been interested in, largely because there's been a historical fiction of glamour, of princesses and queens and sex and bodices and clothes. But there's also a historical
and dresses
fiction.
And accessories
Absolutely.
And paintings and
yeah, it's like
satins,
fashion 500 years ago.
Exactly.
But I think that there's also a historical fiction which is about power, and how certain things about power never change, power and politics. And that's the great collision that I found in Blood and Beauty, this last novel, which is, of course, it's partly about all of those exotic things. There's nowhere, well, the costumes in the church, you don't get any better than that. You don't get more gold than that. But it's also about politics and power. And it's about how the two connect. So in a sense, it's the perfect home for me. Rome, power, romance, the exotic.
inevitably we tend to draw parallels between the worlds you depict and the world we currently live in. Which would you say are the most common features that unite both worlds?
Throughout all of the books, I think the thing that has surprised me most is how powerful religion both was for a long period of time in Europe and how powerful religion has again become in geopolitics now. And I often say, if you really want to understand the problems that we now have dealing with fundamentalist Islam, then we have a perfect place to go back and look at the problems thrown up by fundamentalism, which is fundamentalist Christianity, and the wars that religion caused 500 years ago. So for a secular Europe, we need to understand what the power of belief is and how it can motivate people to think and behave in ways that we now find very unacceptable. But actually we have the answer to that in our own culture. If we go back far enough and penetrate the power of Christianity, the power of Catholicism, the power of sin, the power of martyrdom, the power of heaven, the power of hell, we can understand a lot more about our contemporary society.
What is more challenging to you, to create entirely new characters the way you did with Alessandra in The Birth of Venus, or to repropose already myth-surrounded figures like the Borgias or Fiammetta Bianchini, modeled obviously after Veronica Franco?
Oh, it's very good, modelled obviously after Veronica Franco. I think she's one of many courtesans that I modelled her after. I mean, there were two different versions of what I wanted to do. We don't have very many records of women who have survived history because it's mostly written by men about men.
Yes.
So if I wanted to write about women, what I had to do is to make the history around the moment absolutely accurate. I'm a historian by training. That's really important for me. Why get it wrong when you could get it right? But if I needed to show you character, I needed to make them up and then put them in these moments of great tension, the excitement around the Renaissance in Italy in the 1490s, the rise of a fundamentalist priest in Florence with Savonarola, the role of the courtesan in Venice, how far the state approved or didn't approve, because they needed courtesans but needed to control them, and what the Counter-Reformation started to do when it took away the freedoms for nuns. So in all of those cases, I had to make up characters, always drawing on 6 or 7 little bits of detail that I'd gained from history to create them. With the Borgias, it was a completely different challenge because we do think we know who the Borgias are, but that has come through a mixture of myth and gossip and slander because, of course, the victors write the history and the Borgias lost. So when you say the words Lucretia Borgia, most people immediately think poisoner, sexually voracious, incest with her brother and her father, right? Whereas, in fact, that is the result of accumulated gossip and slander, mostly perpetrated by the enemies of the Borgias, which then became history. And still exists. You know, I think Romania's just had Jeremy Irons' version of the Borgias, you know, which largely follows the same old myths. So my challenge there is to say, you think you know who these characters are.
But wait a minute.
But let me tell you who they really were. Based on the history, but hopefully as exciting as the sensational version. And that's the terrible challenge and trick. How do you make it as entertaining while keeping the history accurate?
Speaking of characters, do you, the author, allow yourself to be completely objective, or quite the opposite? Do you allow yourself to empathize or even love some of your characters in spite the others?
Well, you start thinking that your job is to create them and then put them out there for other people to make up their own minds. Inevitably, if you get lost in the story, you will start to feel some emotional reaction to them. And I suppose the big discovery for me here was Rodrigo Borgia, was the Pope, Alexander VI, who has come down in history as the epitome of all that is corrupt and dreadful in the Catholic Church. Now, I'm not going to tell you that he's an angel. Yes. He is a corrupt and he can be a ruthless figure. You know, what do we know about him? He comes to the papal throne with 4 children who he's going to marry off. What you might also like to know is the Pope before him had children and the Pope after him would have children. So what you're really trying to do is understand why this man of all has got such bad press. And actually there's one very simple key reason, which is this man is not Italian and this family is not Italian. They are Spanish and they are interlopers in an Italy which is already divvied up. All the power is already within Italian family hands. So to make a mark, they have to break into the power structure to create a dynasty. This means they have a lot of enemies, and this means the enemies will start making the gossip and the slander. And I discovered the more I worked on Alexander, the more, it's not that I liked him, it's that I could see his human qualities, right? So he is a very big man. He's literally big.
Yes.
One of my objections to Jeremy Irons is you have to have 7 Jeremy Irons in order to fit into the role.
To make just one Rodrigo Borgia.
Yeah. And he has a big appetite. He has an appetite for life. He has an appetite for politics. He's a really consummate church politician. And he has an appetite for women, right? And funnily enough, I've just come from Italy where the book's been published. And of course, in Italy, they make an immediate comparison between Rodrigo Borgia and Silvio Berlusconi, both big, corrupt, elderly men. The difference being is that Silvio Berlusconi isn't very likable, but Rodrigo Borgia is. Partly because, although they both might like to have sex with women, I think only one of those people really likes women. And from all that I learned about Rodrigo Borgia, he had a genuine fondness and affection and appreciation for women, not just sexually, but as human beings. And the other quality he has, which everybody can relate to, is he loves his children. He is a real father. If there was one person who could have played him, and unfortunately he's now dead, it's the actor James Gandolfini, who was Tony Soprano in The Sopranos. And there you have the modern version of the godfather that he really is. So there are qualities about his love for his children and his sense of humour that made it easy for me to take him out of myth and make him a real human being.
Alma, buscarte has en mí, y a mí, buscarme has en ti. De tal suerte pudo amor alma en mí te retratar, que ningún sabio pintor supiera con tal primor tal imagen estampar. Fuiste por amor criada, hermosa, bella y ansí, en mis entrañas pintada. Si te pierdes, mi amada, alma, buscarte has en mí, que yo sé que te hallarás en mi pecho retratada, y tan al vivo sacada, que si te ves, te holgarás, viéndote tan bien pintada. Y si acaso no supieres dónde me hallarás a mí, no andes de aquí para allí, sino si hallarme quisieres, a mí buscarme has en ti, porque tú eres mi aposento, eres mi casa y morada, y ansí llamo en cualquier tiempo si hallo en tu pensamiento estar la puerta cerrada. Fuera de ti no hay buscarme, porque para hallarme a mí bastará solo llamarme, que a ti iré sin tardarme, y a mí buscarme has en ti.
In all your writings, I sense this immense pleasure of documenting the time, the characters, building up this very solid structure historically.
Yeah.
Am I correct?
Absolutely. I am a historian first and a storyteller second, although of course if that were really true the books would be quite dull and boring.
Yes, I was going to ask you
Yeah.
that. How do you balance history research with fiction, drama and rhythm to make a good book? Not a lecture, not a manual.
It's a really interesting question, and it is at the heart of how you write successful history and fiction together. I do a lot of research. I spend months and months in libraries. It's very enjoyable. It's like being a detective. You're always learning more. You know, you're following a footnote, you're reading a bibliography. You know, it's very exciting learning, okay? And then when I start to realize that I'm reading things I already know, I start to realize that I know enough. And then I put away the research and I start to construct the story. And I suppose my guiding rule is it is the story that must hold the reader. The point is you need to get a reader to want to turn the page. Oh my God, what happens next? Oh, I don't believe this. What is going to happen? That for me is the great power of storytelling, and it exists whether or not you're writing literary fiction or pulp fiction, holding the audience. And within that I start to siphon in the details and the facts that I know, always asking myself, does at any point the history start to shout out and stop you reading the story? So it's about weaving, it's about embroidery. All of the detail and the colour is true, but the real big picture that builds up has to be the power of the drama. And I now know enough that I will read after I've maybe written for 4 or 5 months, and I'll read what I've got, and as soon as I start to get anywhere bored, because I feel like I'm telling somebody something, I cut it out. I cut it out. I'll find another place to put it if it's vital, but there has to be the balance between the two.
Did it ever happen to you to be overwhelmed by a certain topic or story and think or say to yourself, I cannot go to this story up to its end?
I often feel overwhelmed by the material, certainly. And sometimes I feel overwhelmed by the things that I find out. The most powerful version of that was when I was writing Sacred Hearts about nuns, and I became overwhelmed by what I saw as the injustice historically to these women who had been put away into convents. But of course what I was doing then was to become a 21st century writer, saying, from my feminist perspective, these poor women, they didn't have a choice. Whereas actually that's a cardinal sin of a historical novelist, because a historical novelist's job is to go back and inhabit the period without any knowledge that there is a future to come. And if you really did that, then you realize that in some ways these women in convents had a better life than they would have had out of, without having children, without having husbands they didn't love, without getting sexually contracted diseases, without dying in childbirth, etc. So, but apart from that, there is always a moment in every book where I don't think I can do it, where I don't think it's doable, and I particularly can't do it, where I get lost. But I've now written enough books to know that that's part of the process, that being frightened and getting lost is part of the creative process, and that however scared you are, you will find a way through it, and the book will be better for the fact that you've been frightened. Because what it means is you're discovering and you're having to surprise yourself. Whereas if you knew what the whole book was going to be before you started writing it, there would be no sense of discovery. And if there's no sense of discovery for you, then there's going to be no sense of discovery for the reader.
You also teach creative writing, and here we are in the presence of a relatively new concept that is supposed to set the mind of a potential author free of all the stereotypes, of all the things impeding a creative process to fully develop. But this is like putting patterns aside and finding one certain way. But isn't this also a way of creating new literary patterns? I mean, isn't it a double-sided think?
Well, I completely agree with you, actually. First of all, I don't think you can teach people to write.
Yes.
People either have the fascination and the love and the agility and the dexterity and the pleasure that comes from language, or they don't. Either they have the burning need to tell a story, or they don't. You can't teach those qualities. You also can't teach the stamina and the determination that it will take to sit and write a novel, because it's an incredibly long and painful process. What you can do is to talk to people about some of the ways in which you have got through your own creative process. So you can share some of the technical tricks that you learn, some of the tricks you learn about stamina, and then you have to set them free. And actually, I've just touched on one, which is I think that most people feel terrified. Mm-hmm. Most people feel overwhelmed by the critical voice in them that says, you can't do this.
Yes.
And that in order to write, if you have the talent, you need to separate, if you like, the left brain and the right brain. You need to separate the conscious critical voice from the unconscious creative voice. Now, you will need both in order to write a novel, because after you've written something, you'll need somebody to come in and judge it. You'll need what your job is. You'll need the critic to look at it. You need to be both. But in order to write, you need to get rid of the critical voice and you need to get lost. You need to jump out of the aeroplane in the hope that your talent will make the parachute open. So what I can do is I can teach people emotional ways to handle their own fear. I can't teach them how to put words together, and I can't teach them what it takes to write a story that possesses you day and night.
Well, speaking of language, most critics praise your voluptuousness in using the English language in creating almost olfactory or sensorial paintings. Why not? I was going to ask you, are you a language gourmand or gourmet?
Wow. I've become a gourmand, but I started out as a gourmet. Because I studied both English and history, I had a more stringent attitude towards language when I started. And when I was writing thrillers, of course, you can't overdo language because you're pushing through a plot. Mm-hmm. There should be transparency and clarity and elegance, but there can't be voluptuousness. But as soon as you go back into the past, part of my job is to pull you out of modernity, to pull you out of gadgets and technology, and to plunge you into a world full of pain, a world full of different sounds, a world full of dirt, a world full of smells, a world which is profoundly different to how we live now.
A very physical world.
A very physical world, yes. And in order to do that, I have to have language to help me. And very early on, I decided that the present tense was one way of doing it, because you literally cut out the notion that this is the past. Mm-hmm. If you say, I am feeling and smelling and thinking and registering this now. The present tense partly does it for you. And secondly, it was about smelling and seeing and feeling and hearing. And that was one of the ways, and touching, you mentioned earlier, fabric. If you were rich in this period of time, you were surrounded by beauty and glamorous objects. If you were poor, you were equally surrounded by stuff that stank and was coarse and vulgar or whatever.
Yes.
But both of those things need language to pull you in.
You're also a literary reviewer, so you're playing in both sides of the field. Does this allow you to elaborate, to create always successful books that are both critically successful and also in terms of audience?
I review much less than I used to, and I think that's because I don't think novelists should be reviewing, actually. I think they are too embedded in the craft. I think that should be left to people who are reading a vast amount and who can judge between it. And part of the reason that I've stopped reviewing is because I do not read so much contemporary fiction. Now, this is a terrible admission from a writer, but my job over the last 10 years has been to sink deeper and deeper into the past. If you're going to trust my novels, you need to know that I have done my research. And the amazing thing about history at this present moment is it's not static, it's always changing. So, for instance, these 3 novels that I wrote about women and Blood and Beauty afterwards, they couldn't have been written even 30 years ago because we didn't have the historical detail to write them. So I'm always having to read what is the latest research. I'm a bit like, well, I'm not really, but I'm kind of a bit like a nuclear physicist who, if they're going to stay in nuclear physics, has to keep on reading the latest data in order to join the conversation. Now, if I'm going to write really good historically accurate fiction, I'm going to have to stay within history, learning what the latest detail is so I can incorporate it. So I'd make a lousy literary critic now because I don't read enough.
Well, what do you think that has changed in historical fiction since The Agony and the Ecstasy? Let's say if we take this this particular novel, which is a major worldwide hit, and take it as the point zero.
Well, it's a really interesting novel to take as the point zero because it's a fictionalized biography of Michelangelo, right? And so 2 things that are immediately clear is, the first is that we are now really pretty certain that Michelangelo was, if not homosexual, then bisexual, right? Writing in the 1950s, early 1960s, it was not possible for Irving Stone to either know the details of all of that or to express it in a work of popular fiction. If you were now writing a novel about Michelangelo, there is no doubt that his sexuality and his homosexuality would be part of the story. Now, partly we can write that now because so much more research has been done on it. And the other thing missing from that novel largely is women, right? And we now know a great deal more about women's lives in that period and the impact. And Michelangelo did have both relationships, I think, platonically with women and with women of power, right? So 2 areas where we never asked questions before, sexuality and women, have now come into the forefront. And sometimes when I'm doing this work, I think of myself, you use the word painting, and it's a very apt description. I think of myself as a pointillist painter. Pointillism builds up through the series of depths of the points that you put onto a canvas. We now have thousands and thousands more points to put onto the canvas because the detail that we know has changed so much. Now, dot by dot, you don't necessarily notice the change in the picture until you step back. And then the picture has depth. And I think what's happened within good historical fiction is the picture of the past now has infinitely more depth because the number of individual dots and details and facts that we know to fill it out.
Un cavaliere di Spagna cavalca per la via a piedi d'una montagna cantando per amor una fantina voltati in qua bella donzellina voltati un poco a me per cortesia dolce speranza mia ch'io moro per tuo amor. Bella fantina, t'ho donato il cor. Bella fantina, t'ho donato il cor. Bella fantina, t'ho donato il cor. Bella fantina, t'ho donato il cor.
Sex, politics, religion, lust, beauty, glamour, filth, smells, perfumes as well. We have all these ingredients in your books. If we think of your books and try to translate them into motion pictures or TV productions, we have the Borgias you were talking about with Jeremy Irons, yes, or something like the Tudors. I mean, it's like this...
That was a strangle.
Yes. Is it a neo-renaissance, what we are experimenting via your books, tailored to, let's say, the requirements of the today's reader?
Well, I think you're looking at two very different forms, which is the novel and popular television or popular film. Because I think popular television and popular film has to run according to rules, and those are the rules of the market. So if you were to analyse any particular episode of either the Tudors or the Borgias, what you would see is that certain things are needed, or they think that's what's needed to hold an audience. So there would have to be very gorgeous dresses and costumes, right? That's fine, I can go with that. They're accurate, right? There would have to be levels of betrayal and treachery and violence. Actually, I can even go with that, because this is a period full of it. There would also have to be a great deal of sex, right? The problem is that when you put it all together as a formula, it starts to feel like the same old, same old, same old. Whereas, for instance, what I was trying to do in Blood and Beauty, and I have no idea if I achieved it, but it was my aim, which was to say that in this bloody and violent period, the complexity of the politics, if you understand it, will explain people's behaviour. So if you really want to understand how the Borgias and why the Borgias behaved as they did, pay attention to the history. I'll make it easy. I'll make it glamorous. I'll make it entertaining. I'll make you amused. But you are going to have to understand power and how power operates. Now, you could say exactly the same about Romania today, about Britain today, about anywhere in the world. You have to understand the power structures in order to understand behaviour of people. That is why we need good history. And that's why novelists need to make good history entertaining. Because people don't get it from history lessons, they get bored by history lessons. So we need the historians doing the great work, and then we need the good novelists turning the great work into comprehensive, comprehensible, enjoyable, and accurate history and novels. Big deal, isn't it? How do you do it all?
Another Borgia's world shall shine as it did beneath the Caesars.
I've missed you, sir.
I've missed you.
Is it Mihai, Father?
It's something I hate.
You pledge your arms to the service of God.
I do, Your Highness.
The spoils of battle in its entirety. God's blessing comes with a price. I will not have this family at war with itself. We are one, and we will only triumph as one. As family.
To family.
To family.
My mother said, now go to bed.
You have chosen Florence as your second residence city, right, apart London. And I was wondering, does it ever happen to you to wander to the streets of Florence and sometimes just feel like one of your characters?
Well, you know, the idea for The Birth of Venus came from something very similar, and it came from a really silly incident, which is when I first bought this little flat in Florence, actually the bank bought it. I later paid it off because I wrote a novel. I only had one piece of furniture when I bought it, which was a mattress with a duvet on the top of it. And the first night I slept in the apartment, didn't even have any running water, and it was very hot. So I opened the windows, and two things happened. The first is I heard some drunken young men returning home. And the street was very, very narrow. It's a 15th century street. And I heard their voices bounce off the walls, so I could almost hear what they were saying. And I thought, isn't that interesting? So nothing's changed in this street architecturally since the 15th century. Drunken young men can be heard on the top floor 500 years later. And the second thing that happened is I got bitten by mosquitoes, right? And I started to think, Oh, so the mosquito that's now biting me will now leave me, fly through the window and go in through another window and bite somebody else, bite maybe an old man, and our bloods will mingle. And that hasn't changed in 500 years. And they were both the kind of images that the novelist needs to trick themselves into leaving the present, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
And indeed, in The Birth of Venus, there's a moment when Alexandra lies in bed and is bitten by a mosquito and imagines the rather sexual idea of this same mosquito taking her blood, because she can see, she doesn't need to be a scientist, that the mosquito's full of blood, and then going off to somebody else and biting them. So I think that's partly why you need the history to take hold of you and be right, because then you enter the world which you're going to have to describe to other people. And it has to fascinate you and excite you if you're then going to turn it into fiction to excite other people.
Have you ever considered writing about a different historical time as well?
No, no. I grew up, because I'm British, overwhelmed by the history of the Tudors. I really don't want to know anything more about Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. I know every single detail there is to know. But I also grew up very interested in art. And I studied art, but I never studied the Renaissance as a period, either in history or in art. So what happened when I came to it is I was dusting off all my skills from 30 years before when I was a student, but I had a kind of interest. And then when I got into it, I'd never been there before. I'm in the Italian Renaissance till death do us part.
Are you that kind of author that constantly needs to be fed, let's say, with museums, with imagery, with the direct contact with the art of that time?
Well, a lot of it's in my mind. You know, I can close my eyes now and see a panoply of images just because I've studied them so much. I do, of course, partly live in a country where those images are everywhere. You know, that is one of the extraordinary things about Italy. Partly because she's a Catholic country that never had a Reformation. So all of those images from the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries are still there. And certainly the city I partly live in, Florence, is a living museum in certain ways. The trick is to find stuff you haven't seen before. You know, I have a local church called Sant'Ambrogio, and I recently went in and found a fresco I'd never realized was there. And it actually turns out to be a fresco by one of the artists who painted part of the Sistine Chapel before Michelangelo. And when I study the fresco, I realize that it is a portrait of the entrance to my church in Sant'Ambrogio 500 years ago. And then if I start to study individual figures in that, I, for instance, found a woman with hair almost as long as the Pope's young mistress's hair, for which Giulia Farnese was famous.
Yes.
So I had an image that fed my imagination again. So yes, you need to keep yourself being fed, but the diet will never run out. There's going to be food forever for me in Italy.
All books, historical, fictional, academic books left aside, all the TV or the big screen productions forgotten. If you were to show someone Renaissance, and that Renaissance that words can describe, what painting or what sculpture would you choose?
Oh, I know exactly what I'd pick. I'd take them to the Brancacci Chapel in Florence,
Yes.
which is part of the Carmini convent. And they would find a series of frescoes created in the 1420s.
Yes.
So early that the Renaissance just almost doesn't exist, by a young painter called Masaccio, who will die at the age of 27.
Very young, yes.
And I won't even show you the biblical stories, although they're there. What I will show you is how biblical stories at this period start to be set in real Italy. So if you like, this is the beginning of humanism. Real people will stand next to biblical characters. And I think it's in the giving of the tribute, I will show you an image of a woman standing on a street who's not famous, who's not rich, who has a turban on her hair, who has a slightly drawn face, and who's carrying in her arms a very young baby. And the baby has no nappy on, because this is a very young baby, and you can see the baby's bottom as it is held in her arm. And it is a portrait of an ordinary woman who has recently had a child. It's a portrait of motherhood. It's a portrait of the ordinary, and she looks real. And you can almost put out your hands to touch the flesh of the baby's bottom. And it absolutely sums up for me when humanity and the human form, flesh and blood and in 3 dimensions, enters our ability to reproduce the world, and when an ordinary woman on the street becomes part of what we will remember about history, as well as the famous.
Thank you very much.